Good morning, colleagues. First, let's start off saying a few disclaimers and disclosures. I'm Hamid Rashid. I'm the head of Global Macro. I'm an economist. My views here are my personal views, not the views of the United Nations. That's the first disclaimer. So don't attribute it to my employer. Second thing is that I don't have any PowerPoint. If you're looking for a PowerPoint, unfortunately, I'm sorry to disappoint you. And third, if you don't understand me, my accent or anything else, please feel free to interrupt anytime. I'll be able to, make it clearer for you. So what I would discuss today as an economist about the challenges that we see from the outside in the mining sector. What are the key challenges? And I would link it to our UN mandates, the mandates that we have in terms of promoting sustainability, right? That's our main goal. We have set of goals called Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them. The most critical one for this audience is Goal 13, or the unlucky 13, but it's not unlucky, is the climate action. So in that goal, broadly speaking, we have the objective of achieving net zero. Targets may vary, 2030, 2050, whatever date you take into account. And the mean that in the process, we want to decarbonize the global economy. That's the goal, right? So that goal would be a very simple goal if we had no constraints, if we could do things at our own leisurely pace, and we could probably at some point achieve that goal in 100 years' time or 200 years' time. But the binding constraint for that goal is time, which is extremely critical for us to understand that we don't have a lot of time. So if time was not a constraint, we could do several things to achieve that goal. One goal could be that there's also in the SDGs, called SDG 12, the goal number 12, changing our consumption and production patterns. If we consume less, we can actually achieve our decarbonization goal. Less consumption would mean less production, and ultimately we can have less carbon footprint. But that goal is not achievable, especially if you think about, if you tell and go to some developing countries and someone who's just about to have enough money to buy a car, so no, you don't buy a car because this is going to pollute the world. So they would not listen. So they would once I have the right to also drive a car or have an air conditioning in my house. So that change would not take place. There are other technologies available also to achieve that goal. For example, carbon capture, carbon removal, and carbon capture. Again, that's a very process that we are not at any kind of scale that can actually achieve that goal, right, in terms of decarbonizing the world economy. We also hear a lot about recycling. Recycling can reduce the carbon footprint, but again, the question is that we don't have enough sort of technology or the behavioral commitment to achieve the net zero target with recycling. So then what is the option for us? The last option is that we have certain things that we can do with technology, mainly the battery materials and producing renewable energy. So that's where I think you folks come from in terms of the mining industry and critical minerals that can play a very important role to achieve the decarbonization goals. And that is probably the best option that we have at hand, given the time constraint. But I'll talk about some other constraints that is probably more relevant for this audience in terms of how do you really mobilize the resources that we need, the critical minerals that we need to achieve that goal. Because everyone would agree that recycling would not solve the problems of decarbonization. We would not be able to solve the problem of decarbonization or achieve the goal of decarbonization with carbon removal. So as of now, as of today, the best technology that we have is to really accelerate the process of renewable energy generation. And that would require a lot of mining, a lot of basically taking things out of the earth and producing the critical minerals that we need to turbocharge our effort to have the battery materials that can give us renewable energy sources. So this is the more or less the framework that we see, but obviously it's not so straightforward. If it was just goal of achieving carbon negativity or net zero, then we could easily do that, even with the critical minerals that we have. But the problem, we see that this goal is conflated with two other goals, which are more recent phenomena. One is the goal of energy security. Like many countries now pursue energy security goal as if it's an independent goal, independent of the decarbonization goals. Namely, it's countries that are endowed with fossil fuel and say coal, they want to secure or maintain their energy security by relying heavily on the fossil fuel. And they don't want to give that up. If you look at what happened after the Ukraine war started 2 years ago, Poland has a huge deposit of coal, and coal production, coal output increased significantly because that became an energy security argument for countries which has a lot of resources, fossil fuel and other resources. Second, even more critical or difficult goal that is combined with this decarbonization goal is the goal of more like national security goals. There's a growing sort of tension around the world. We see that countries are now all vying for those critical minerals, not so much to protect or to achieve the decarbonization goals, but to make sure they are not dependent on one country. And there's an implicit, almost, nobody wants to talk about it explicitly, but the policy called ABC. I don't know how many of you know the ABC policy, especially in the Western countries, anything but China. So that's a mindset that is also growing right now, that we cannot rely on China because China has an advantage in critical mineral production, especially on the processing side, and that would be a national security threat going forward. So how did China get to have that advantage? It was not given to it. Back in the 70s, China realized that they were heavily disadvantaged vis-a-vis the European and North American economies because they didn't have oil. So very early on, they actually invested heavily on research on critical minerals to make sure they can, in 20, 30 years' time, they can reduce their dependence on fossil fuel and have alternative energy sources. China built the capacity over the last 40 years to be a major player in the renewable energy sector. Call it solar panels, call it wind turbines, or EV materials. All of them are really controlled in China, and they play a very important role. I'll not go into the geopolitics of it. I think the point here is that when we combine all three goals, decarbonization goals, national security goal, and energy security goal, it gets very messy. And you can't really pursue a global policy to achieve the predominant goal, what I started with, the goal SDG 13, climate action. So what we are seeing right now globally, the tension between the West and the East in terms of geopolitics is actually affecting climate action. It can be seen as good news because then a lot of interests are now cropping up about finding new sources, new resources for the battery materials. I hear a lot about what's happening in Quebec in terms of building capacity for a battery hub in North America. There are many other initiatives that are coming to reduce dependence on China. But again, time is not on our side. So it may delay climate action that we need urgently because we need 3 or 4 Chinas to meet our energy demand, renewable energy demand. So it's not just replacing one China with another China or another group of countries that can compete with China, but rather we need to scale up the capacity significantly over what we have right now. So, but then why isn't happening? Why the pace is so slow? And this is my second part of my discussion here. Because if we all agree that this is the goal we must pursue, the goal to scale up renewable energy production, and if we have the will, we have the resources, then we should see a lot of money flowing into the critical minerals sector. But I'm sure many of you are investors, but I have talked to many investors, big banks. They're often very, very reluctant to put their money in the critical minerals sector. They feel, oh, it's too risky, not in my backyard, kind of a mindset that they all want to, at least not all, many of them want to drive Teslas, but they don't want to invest in upstream activities and midstream activities that can produce Teslas. So there's a huge dichotomy here in terms of what we want and what we need. Okay, so we need a lot of investments in the critical minerals sector, but it's not happening. So the biggest challenge for the investment, from the investment point of view, what we see is that there's a high degree of technological uncertainty. If you look at right now, that every projection that we have an agency called International Energy Agency, IEA, all the projections that we need 5 times more lithium between now and 2030. But if you look at the supply curve, the rate pace, the way it's growing, we have a huge gap in 2030 in terms of the anticipated demand and the supply of lithium. And go by metal, you can go almost all the critical minerals, and there's no agreed list of critical minerals, but 5 or 6 of them, you see the gap is getting wider, not narrower, in terms of the demand and the supply. And how do you explain this? Because if we all believe the demand would be soaring in 5 years' time, money should come in very quickly, and that's what standard economics tell us. Like, we see a demand and we respond to the demand by increasing supply. The main challenge, as I said, is a technological uncertainty, because many of the investing, especially at the big investment level, they see that this landscape is still evolving. What technology would win? Will it be LFP versus NMC, or is it going to be completely replaced by something else? I hear a lot of discussions about alternatives to lithium-ion batteries, leapfrogging, whether the US and other countries would rely on lithium technology or go to, say, magnesium-ion batteries or magnesium cell batteries or sodium cell batteries or other technologies that are probably would challenge significantly the incumbent technology that we have right now. So technological uncertainty is really affecting investment, but that's not the only factor. There are other factors as well, but that's a major challenge for this sector, because investors want to have certain degree of uncertainty, certain degree of certainty to put their money in. Now, there are some technologies that are actually very desirable. We need technology, for example, exploration is still very primitive in the critical minerals sector. We have a lot of deposits around the world, but it takes 5-6 years to find a viable deposit. An amount of time and upfront investment that we need. And same with refining and processing, is technology is also not up to the standard. So where we, in some areas, technology is actually a good thing for the mining sector. In other areas, it's actually hurting the mining sector. Because if the laboratories all over the country, they're trying to find a replacement for LFPs, then it's very difficult to convince the investors to invest more in lithium, because lithium may be out of fashion in 10 years' time. We may not need any lithium. We may leapfrog to some other technology. But at the same time, some technologies are very desirable to make the mining sector more efficient and more, in terms of reducing the carbon footprint. Because one of the challenges, second challenge for the mining sector to get enough investment, especially in the upstream, is that mining is still perceived as a dirty industry where it pollutes, it extracts, it takes things away from the earth. We have very strong love relationship with our earth, Mother Earth, right? We don't want, and extraction is sort of a negative connotation for the industry, like we extract. But actually it gives back a lot too. But we don't talk about the giving back. We just talk about the extractive industry. So that's the challenge. So reputational challenge is also very important. Many of the investors that at the aggregate level, at the global level, they say, look, we can convince our clients that it's good for us to invest in a mining company. And the third problem in terms of technology and the perception is also the problem of time inconsistency. Because upstream and midstream activities is a long gestation period. Like you need, if you find something, or if you spot an area where you may find something, from there to production, it's a 10-year cycle. And most of the financing, they want to have quick payoff, at least contemporaneous payoff. So investments are long-term, but returns are all 5 years or 10 years down the road. But all the costs are upfront. They have to front load the cost. And many of the farms and businesses, they don't want to do that because there's a huge risk. I was talking to some banks. They were saying, look, when we see negative cash flow for first 5 years of the project, it's very difficult to convince our investors like this is a viable project. Because they do say, okay, the 6th year, your book tells us that we'll have a positive return, but there's a lot of uncertainty there. So, and the fourth problem also is a problem, and I'll have two more problems that will come to the solution. Another problem is that problem between the incumbent players and the new entrants. Mining is still fairly concentrated in terms of who calls the shot. Few big mining companies actually have a huge advantage, and their interests are not always aligned with the small marginal mines that want to come to the pipeline. In terms of the smaller companies actually can be very efficient, and this happens in the tech sector as well. If you look at the history of that Silicon Valley evolution, the two ways that the tech companies became giants, first is that they innovated. Second way, by buying out competitors. So any small firm that started innovating, Microsoft started buying them out or killed them completely. So that worked. And same thing happens in the mining sector, because few large companies, they actually dominate the scene, and there's very little, their cost of capital is lower, given their reputation, given their access to the market, and they can easily raise capital. But a small mining company is much harder to raise capital and be viable, because the risks are disproportionately higher for smaller firms, because they have to actually have significant overhead, whereas this overhead can be spread across many firms in a large mining company. So that's another challenge that there's no easy solution to that, in terms of how do you really square the circle in terms of making sure the mining, the big miners and small miners, actually this have a common interest and common way of achieving the goal that we have in mind. The first goal is the climate action, but a mining company may not care about the global goal, because they would think, okay, what's our bottom line? If we allow more competition, then our margins will fall, and ultimately will be out of business. So I think that's where the challenges are. And finally, that if you look at the divide between developed and developing countries, that's another major challenge, because many of the developing countries, they had bad experience with mining in the previous century. Mining was always seen as some outside big companies coming in, taking all the rent out, and what we had at that time is called resource curse or Dutch disease. I don't know, some of you might be familiar with that, meaning that there's a lot of outputs from the mines, whether it's oil in Nigeria or gold in Ghana and other countries, but that didn't lead to economic development per se. People didn't benefit. A few benefited. Of course, corruption played a very important role, but even without corruption, where you had, so there's a little benefit that trickled down to the communities and the people. So there's a huge still backlash against that experience that many developing countries faced. And we at the UN, we are trying to say, no, we can make it a win-win game. We can make it work for the developing countries this time. They can avoid the resource curse that they had in the past. Having a lot of natural resources is not a blessing. It is a curse. But we're trying to turn this into a blessing, meaning that they can learn from the past experiences and do better this time. And better means better contracts, concessions, royalty structures, and all these things, because there's a huge asymmetric power. Again, a big mining company and a national government, they often can't negotiate deals, fair deals, because many countries don't have the capacity. They can't even hire an attorney in paying like $1,000 an hour, where a big firm can easily hire the best attorneys and say, okay, this is the best deal you can get. So there's a huge challenge in terms of maximizing the benefits of the critical minerals sector in the developing countries without completely revamping the way we do business. And this is where you can see a serious challenge, because many countries, especially given that 30% of the critical minerals are in Africa, all the mineral resources combined, critical minerals, are in Africa, and there the investment is the lowest. You see more investment in Latin America or other parts of the world, but not so much in Africa. Of course, there are conflicts, there are political challenges, there are problems of corruption, but if we don't have enough investment in the African continent, we'll not be able to achieve the goals that we have for the critical minerals. So all problems. Now, what can we do about it, right? What are the solutions? I think this is the time that we have been pushing in the multilateral forums to have some common framework for the critical mineral sectors. Our Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Guterres, he just announced a new panel on critical minerals. Even at the UN, we are thinking about it. That's why I'm here. We have belatedly we have realized that our goals are very much dependent on the mining sector, which was not even what I have talked to many friends in the mining community. When we adopted the goals, 17 goals in 2015, the goals that I started with, Sustainable Development Goals. And we have 169 targets under those 17 goals, but not a single reference to mining. You can find fisheries, you can find anything under the sun, but no reference to mining. But mining is a critical part of human existence, not just for this century, ever since we became a human race. You talk about the Stone Age, you could talk about the Iron Age, and all these different ages we went through. Mining played a very important role, but there's no mention of mining there. And that's an omission. And partly also it reflects that mining is not seen as something critically important for the global community. So there's a huge communication problem that needs to be bridged as well. So to first sort of way forward that we see, of course, this is not at the individual level, but at the macro level, is that to change the narrative in terms of time sensitivity and what we need to do to get where we need to go by 2030 or 2035. So having a complete new narrative around mining and create a global consensus that these are the critical sectors. Of course, there are a lot of risks there, and we have to think about how to address those risks. But first important objective is to have a new narrative around the critical minerals, that this is not just about geopolitics, this is not just about national energy security, but it's also about achieving the climate goals. The second thing, I think this is most important, is that to stabilize the technology space. Meaning, what do I mean by that? So if we're chasing the wild goose, bird in the cage is better than bird in the bush. So if we are constantly chasing a better technological solution for renewable energy generation, we may not settle, meaning that right now it's up in the air. People are waiting where the dust would fall, and then we'll decide how much to invest. So there's some degree of global effort needed to stabilize the technological change in the batteries space. Meaning, it's easier said than done, but thing is that some of that technology is really not helping the sector in terms of if we believe that magnesium cell batteries would be the future in 10 years' time, nobody would invest in lithium. And I think we have to have more clarity. We talked to many scientists, and they said, we are still far off, but market has a different way of looking at things. They said, okay, if it's too far off, it's a moonshot. Somebody would try to achieve that and collect the premium. If they can solve the problem, there'll be a return for that approach, that solution. So stabilizing the mining space, the technology space will be very important. Encouraging certain technology and discouraging others, meaning that there are ways China did, there are ways other countries did. We talk a lot about industrial policies these days. We need industrial policy at a global scale. Some technologies are very desirable for the mining sector, but others are not so much. And there can be incentive structures that can actually promote certain technological choices at this point to support the critical mineral exploration, extraction, and processing, so that we have far more downstream materials for the renewable energy generation. And the final point that I would highlight is that ultimately it all comes down to money. How do we mobilize more resources? And this is where we are more ambitious in terms of our expectation that there needs to be a global Marshall Plan, the kind of a plan that can actually really create a big pot of resources. The problem is that many of the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, they have huge amount of resources available, but none of the money is going into mining. If you look at the world's largest pension fund, Norwegian pension fund, they have no exposure to mining, partly because they can't invest in upstream activities that is in a country which is not rated, credit rating, or at least above investment grade credit rating. And none of the African countries, except for South Africa, has a credit rating that is investment grade. So that means by default, there's no investment. But this is where we need to have a better discussion about how do we bring those the big funds to the mining sector to mobilize resources that we need within the short time frame that we have. And this is where all the great minds need to come together and find out how do you create a fund, global mining fund, global critical minerals fund, whatever you call it, to make sure the resources are available, especially resources for the marginal mining companies that are trying to enter the market and challenge the incumbent. So we want more competition in the mining sector, not less. So I think that would require sort of a global sort of commitment, either at the UN level or even in G20 or G7, that we need to mobilize more resources for this sector. Thank you.